Welcome to Tech Bytes, API testing concepts. Hello friends, thank you for visiting my class. Today we are going to discuss about API testing concepts. What is API? So before we go into details about the API testing, let's try to understand what is an API. API stands for Application Programming Interface. What it means? Say for example there are two different software applications where they have to exchange data between those two applications, or else where they have to exchange some communication, some anything between those two systems. So in order to happen that one, so the mechanism or the media or the communication channel is the API, which is the application programming interface. So this is what called the API. So as we already noted, documented here, so it enables the communication and also it enables the data transfer between two different software applications. Right. Let's try to understand the typical software application, how it is. So before we go even understanding about the API testing, we need to understand the API, right? So now if you see the typical software application diagram, so basically we have the presentation layer, business layer, and the database layer. The presentation layer is the one where the end user or the end customer focuses on that one. Where the end user sees the application is the presentation layer. So it's a customer facing. Now when you look at the business layer, so that is the layer where you have the functionality of the application, where the logical representation or the logic will run between the system. So and if you see the last layer, it's a database layer where it stores the data from the application, whether it could be any customer information or it could be any transaction data, anything which is stored in the database, right? That's the database layer. So the business layer is the intermediate one. The business layer is the middle system when we compare with the database and the presentation layer. So API focuses mainly on the business layer. So API focuses on the logic of the application, either to exchange data or to exchange the information between two software applications or systems. So now let's try to understand what is API testing. So testing the business layer of the software application. So whatever the application we have, the presentation layer and the database layer and the between the business layer, right? So the focusing the testing on the business layer, which is the logical layer, so that is called the API testing. So in the API testing, the focus will be mainly on the business logic, and the testing will not focus on the UI, which is user interface. So as part of the API testing, we don't test anything how the user enters the data, how it displays the data to the user. It all how the data goes from the presentation layer to the database layer using the business layer. So that is where our focus is on the logical layer, which is nothing but the API testing. And for the API testing, the testers will mainly focus on the way how they input the data. So that means we don't need to focus and we don't need to input the data the way how we in general we input. Say for example, if it is a UI application, say for example a banking application or something, user enters the data in the system using keyboard in a username or password text boxes. But when it comes to the API testing, the same data we don't enter the way how we enter the UI application. The data we send it in a different way. So for that, either we may use any API testing tools to enter the data, or else a specific software application developed just to transfer the data between the two applications. So that's how the API testing will be performed. Now let's try to understand the API testing type. So basically unit testing. So what it means is testing the individual business component. So that's called the unit testing with terms of the API testing. And load testing. So in the testing the load, the business components under multiple load. Say for example when we have a specific API, but how the system behaves, how the API works if there is a certain amount of load. So that testing is called the load testing with respect to API. And security testing. So it is mainly testing the application. As we said, the APIs are mainly to exchange the information or the data or the communication between two different software applications. So the security testing mainly focuses on if there is any vulnerabilities, if there is any external system attack, if there is any threats between the data exchange. So all those things we have to make sure the system is uh, good enough to handle all those things. That kind of testing is called the security testing in terms of the APIs. And there are other testings also, but these are the major testing types from the API testing. So now let's try to understand the API testing objective. What is the objective of the API testing? Here, see, the main objective is validate the written type of the API response. Say what whether the response says it's a success or failure. That is one of the objectives of the API testing. And validate the return value of the API. So what is the data? So whatever the data we are getting, that data we need to validate. Validate the system authentication. During the APIs, right? So we have to make sure who is calling the system. The source system, whatever is making a call to the destination system, we have to authenticate whether the system is secure or not. So that is called this way we are going to validate the system authentication, and also validate whether the API calls in linked to different API. Say for example, if we call a API, the target API can internally make one more call to a different API. So this is called the linked APIs. So this is also one of our objectives, making sure the linked API gets called by the target API. So these are the different objectives of the API testing. So test cases for the API testing. So in order to design test case for the API testing, it all depends on the different outcomes of the API response. So in order to design test cases for the API testing, so we have to consider what is the response what from the API. So considering the response, what type of response we expect and what type of response we should not expect, considering those things we'll write the test cases. Let's take one of those is the authentication success. Say for example, when if the source system calls the API with the right credentials, we should get a authentication success. So that is one test case, and the second one is authentication failure, and the next one is response success true or the response success false. Say for example, if we are making a call API call, if the based on the request, if the system say gives a success response or the failure response, we have to write test cases considering in what situation we get a success equal to true or in what condition we get success equal to false. So those things we have to write in terms of the test cases. And the response positive data and response negative data, some it all depends the type of input data we are providing, right? So the response could have a data which is valid, or else the response could have a data invalid. So in order to replicate both the scenarios, we need to have specific test cases, separate test cases to test both these conditions. And the next one is response no data. Yes, in some situations the API may not give any response, it just could be blank, or else it won't give any data also. So in order to test that condition also, to see how our APIs will be handling specific conditions, we have to make sure we are going to test that particular test data, use that particular test data and execute that specific test case. And also exception scenario. So how our APIs will handle if there is any exception from the target system. So those things also we need to perform testing. So that's way, that is one more test case we need to write for the exception scenario. And response type, another API called internally, as we discussed in the previous slide. So the one of our test objective, validate whether API calls linked API different linked API or not, right? So I mean when we call a API, the target system will call in turns a different API to get response. So whenever we have that kind of functionality in our system, so we have to have different test case to test that scenario, right? So now let's try to understand how we are going to test these APIs. As we already told, either we should have use some specific tools, API testing tools, or else we need to use specific application developed just to test the APIs alone. So there are in the market there are several tools available to do the API testing, but the one of the widely used tools are SOAP UI, Postman, or Advanced REST Client, or JMeter. These are the few, but there are many tools available in the market to perform the testing. So SOAP UI handles both SOAP and REST client calls, and also Postman handles both REST client and advanced REST client also, JMeter also. These are all different software testing tools used to do the API testing. And even we have the HP UTF also does some API testing. So with this one, we'll wind up the session on the API testing basics. Thank you friends for watching the video. If you like the video, please share, like and comment, and we'll come back to you and we'll meet you again with a different type of testing concepts in the next session. Thank you all. Thank you.